Hi everyone, I'm Kadambari Sahu. I'm the head of design at Value Lab. Design Inspire is a web series of passionate, innovative, and young inspiring designers. The web series dive into their passion, inspiration, and what makes them go. It's an effort to understand how they are navigating their career path and how they are investing their creative energies. We believe hearing their bold moves and inspiring stories will ignite interest and inspire the next generation of budding designers across the globe. So let's go forward. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Design Inspire. Our today's guest is Katerina Markova. Katerina is a designer with experience in a variety of roles from contributor to design leadership. She has worked in B2B and B2C environment. She has worked with companies like Namecheap, where she has led the entire brand experience division. Good Data, where she was responsible for user experience of analytical dashboards, and Oracle, where she worked on a developer-oriented platform to build channel-agnostic chatbot. At last, she joined McKinsey Company, where she split her time between designing unique experiences for client-facing digital product, promoting the value of design across the organization, and helping non-designers to bring user-centric design principles into their day-to-day work. Welcome, Katrina. How are you doing today?
Hi, Kadambari. I'm fine. How are you?
We good, Katrina. So, Katrina, I'll call you Kat for most of the session now. Kat, what we'll do is the format of the show would be something like this. The first part is where you talk about anything which inspires you, motivates you, or your design journey, or any stories that you want to share with us. And the second part would be like a conversation between me and you, where most of the questions that I'll ask you are collated by the team here called User Experience Group at Valley Labs. So let's go forward and hear your story. We're very excited to hear them. Over to you, Katrina.
Thank you. So let me share my screen with you. So hi, everyone. I'm Kat, as Kadambari said. I'm super excited to be here today because when I got the invite to join, it was my birthday. And when the invite said the initiative is about connecting young and inspiring designers, I was like, well, this is your last chance because people won't call you that for much longer. So that's so here I am today. And thank you, Kadambari, for the intro because I don't have to do that. I think it would be a good moment to say that any opinions that I'll share with you today are my own and not those of my employer. And I also need to apologize because I think the topic of the talk that originally I said I would do was about diverging, converging in iteration and my talk and my journey as a designer. But in the spirit of the series and sharing about our passions and what keeps us going, I decided to share with you a project that I have been working on for as long as I can remember. And it's also through this project that I met Kadambari at the Interaction 20 conference in Milan this February, back when the world was still normal. So today I'll be talking about the Dead People project and the sensitivity for designers. I guess in a sense, diverging, converging, and iterations are inevitably a part of my story anyway. And that is because it's the underlying principle of this whole project. But I also talk about why we as designers should care about death of our users. Long story short, eventually our users will die, and we can make it easier on them and their bereaved by acknowledging it from the start. So the project really isn't one single project. It's mostly a collection of research, thinking, writing, talking, and the topics that I cover evolve as I learn new things. I do have an umbrella name for it in several languages. I use the name the Dead People Project in English, Mortinhos, when I speak about it in Portuguese, or Mrtvolky when I speak about it in Czech. If you wonder why these three languages, it's because I spent a considerable amount of time in these cultures, and I did different parts of the work in one of these languages and their respective, and the context of their respective cultures. I embarked on this journey about 15 years ago when my dad died and my sister and I had to deal with his legacy. Although Facebook wasn't a thing yet, and most of the online services we use today for that matter, dealing with his digital assets was so challenging that I began to ask myself whether there was a way I could contribute to change. Over the time, I admittedly fell in love with the problem, looking for answers to the question, how might we improve and support grieving in a world that is increasingly digital, became an intrinsic part of my life. It fascinates me for several reasons. For one, I'm intrigued by the complexity because it touches many different areas like law, ethics, psychology, technology, and other nested areas within these areas. But it's also a global problem. The other reason is its increasing relevance. The digitalization is ongoing, and according to the recent International Data Corporation report, the amount of data created over the next 3 years will be more than the data created over the past 30 years. And finally, I know we can do better. The current state of things present us with a huge opportunities for improvement. So enough of the intro. So let's start with what is digital death. In theory, digital death occurs when a person becomes incapable of taking an active part in their digital life. In other words, if I got ran over a car today, my family would inherit a bunch of things, like books, my digital devices, perhaps some money, but I wouldn't be able to actively participate in my digital life anymore, so I'd be digitally dead. But wait, even if I die, I still participate in the digital life because I most likely keep receiving emails or show up in social networks. Which brings a really interesting question. Is it even possible to experience digital death in today's world? When talking to people about this, at this point, there is usually a light bulb moment. Their eyes brighten up and they say, I got this. It's about what happens to my Facebook when I die. Well, yes and no. While this is certainly a topic, personally, I think that unless the deceased left clear instructions on how to handle their social media after their death, it should be at the discretion of the bereaved. I'm way more interested in what a person's death means practically when it comes to digital assets, what effects it has on the people left behind, and ultimately what we can do as individuals or society to facilitate these processes to reduce the unnecessary burden and overall improve the quality of coping with one's loss. In the physical world, regardless of the geographical location, we have a set of established legal, social, and cultural norms. And these norms help us through the situation. In the digital world, however, the necessary conventions are either inaccurate or non-existent. For example, in the United States, the Uniform Fiduciary Access to Digital Assets Act was enacted in 2015. It allows fiduciaries to manage digital property like domains or cryptocurrencies while keeping the access to digital communication restricted. Until then, the only legislation applicable to digital communication was the Electronic Communications Privacy Act from 1986. It wasn't even sure whether email was intellectual property or not. In the European Union, the situation isn't much better. For example, GDPR that introduces a very strong protection on information privacy explicitly states that it only applies to living data subjects, which means that dead are not protected at all. The individual state members have to do this on their own, and only very few do. Therefore, the approach to the digital remains relies heavily on what individual companies decide. It's important to recognize that technology evolves quickly and we struggle to keep pace with it. In the meantime, we are mostly on our own. We should be asking questions like, when the time comes, will somebody be able to get to the utility bills that regularly arrive to my email? Or will someone be able to access my paid subscriptions and cancel them? Will someone be able to let my customers know that I will no longer design their website? How will my family know that I had a Revolut account? And you could probably imagine many more. Luckily, there is a concept of phenotysensitivity that allows us to evaluate and identify potential depth-related problems when designing interactive systems, as well as to seek opportunities for their improvement. So let me explain finally what the word phenotysensitivity means. Here's the definition. Phenotysensitivity is a novel, humanistically grounded approach to HCI, research, and design that recognizes and actively engages with the facts of mortality, dying, and death in the creation of interactive systems. It was introduced in the year 2009 by Michael Massimi and Andrea Cherise, who were at the time researchers at the University of Toronto. When considering death and dying, the common human-computer interaction approach, create and wait what happens, can have a traumatic impact on the emotional balance of the users. Massimi and Cherise propose that we should let go of the technology and seek for inspiration and knowledge in the realm of social sciences. Using phenotysensitivity as a lens to look at problems at hand can help us to solve problems such as, how do we deliver adequate information to one's hands after somebody dies in a timely manner? What constitutes inheritable data? Which data should be considered private after one's death? How can we support users to make an informed decision about which data should be shared after their death and with whom? If they don't leave instructions, what should be the default? How do we design for groups of people who outlive one another or coexist in different phases of their lives? So now that I spoke a little bit about why and where we should take death into consideration, let's look at a few examples of products and services that do it already. Most of them belong to so-called digital afterlife industry and fall into one of the following categories: posthumous messaging, online memorials, information management, which also includes funeral and digital estate planning, and finally, recreation services. So the first example that I want to share with you is a website called Moje Smrt. Really nicely done website for funeral planning. It was created for an NGO, which is a Czech NGO, and that provides professional care to the dying and their loved ones. The website itself allows its users to write up their wishes regarding the final moments of their lives and share it with people of their choice. It is possible to share everything or only its parts. Obviously, there are many other services, and of course, most of them in English, that do a similar thing. These websites have diverse mechanisms of releasing the stored information. Often, the services prompt periodically the original user for a signal of life. In some cases, several people have to confirm one's death before the information gets shared. But very often, the selected beneficiaries have access to the information already during the original person's life. The primary reason why these services don't safeguard the access to the information too much is that the beneficiaries often need the access to the information really quickly after one's death. Another example is a website, My Web Will. It used to be a Swedish digital estate planning website. And I said used to, and I chose this example precisely because the service no longer exists. The service offered its users the possibility to specify their wishes for what should happen to their digital accounts. It was integrated with a long list of other services, and its users could decide on and to whom, which accounts should be deactivated or deleted, and in some cases, even what content should be modified on their profiles. The service was launched in October 2009, and while it had a far superior user experience to its competitors, it was out of business by November 2011. I'd like to think that it was because they were ahead of the time to make their business model viable. But what I want to point out is that going through the trouble of setting up your preferences for all your online accounts takes a lot of time and effort. And especially when it comes to the paid services, it's super frustrating when you go through all this and then the service shuts down without a good replacement. A few other similar services that emerged around the same time, like Entrusted or Legacy Locker, lasted a bit longer, and they were acquired mostly by password management companies. And they actually offered their users a succession plan, which was much better than the previous example. One more example from the digital estate planning category is a company called Everplans. They have a very different approach because they provide an online tool that allows the users to organize their information from both the physical and the digital world side by side. Next to the list of digital assets, you can enter your emergency information, information about your employment, vehicles, real estate, etc. And the information can be private, but you can also decide to share it. The uniqueness of this service is that they offer a white labeled option. This is a great thing, for example, for attorneys who can use this as an extension to their legacy management services. The advantage is that the client confidentiality is maintained, while the client has access to update their information as much as necessary. Comparably to a regular will, this allows a far greater control without the need to rewrite it each time somebody changes the password. The last example I'm going to share with you is a bit more futuristic. Safe Beyond is a company that offers a combination of digital estate planning, but it also makes a leap towards recreation services. They allow its users to set up messages to be delivered after one's death. So the message delivery can be triggered by a specific date, for example, when somebody has a birthday, or location, like the place that the deceased first met their partner, or an event, like a birth of a child. To be on the safer side, they ask the potential recipients to agree to receive the messages and to install their app on their device. But since we are speaking of recreation services, there are already attempts to allow us to build chatbots that essentially mimic us and allow our loved ones to keep the conversation going after we are gone. Sort of like what you can see in some of the Black Mirror episodes. Perhaps the best known of these experiments is called Replica.ai. And there are lots of ethical implications with services like these. And we are going to talk a little bit about it in a moment. So where are some of the opportunities when considering death in the digital process? There is a number of challenges that we need to consider. And so I'm going to share some of the most critical ones. The first one being, how might we redefine death-related rituals in the digital world to support mental health of the dying and bereaved? Until recently, the rituals we had allowed us a certain level of control over how we encounter and experience death and dying. With the rise of technology, however, and the social media in particular, we no longer have the option to grieve on our own terms. Another one is, how might we improve policies to reduce burden of processing one's digital legacy? As I mentioned earlier, the regulations regarding digital assets are still in their infancy, especially when it comes to addressing the digital assets of the deceased. As a result, what we can or can't do with our digital estate is to a great extent shaped by commercial companies, or we have to spend a good amount of time finding our own workarounds. Another one is, how might we embrace the global nature of death and dying in the digital world? We need to be mindful of the fact that we all use digital products and services that are from all over the world. It's hard to devise a one-size-fits-all approach or best practices, given the geographic variation of regulations and rituals. How might the digital products and services verify users' death with certainty? Some companies like Facebook or LinkedIn collect information about who died through online forums and even allow you a bit of control of what you'd like to do with the information on their platform once you're gone. Other companies like Google rely on user-defined time threshold to trigger process of distributing data according to users' preferences. There are also companies that ask their users to predefine and notify beneficiaries upfront. None of these systems are 100% reliable, and they risk creating a lot of frustration and anxiety. And finally, how might we ensure that what we do is ethical and not solely profit-driven? Most business decisions are based on growth and profitability. We mostly worry about attracting new users and maximizing revenues through higher engagement rates. We don't ask the question, shall we do this often enough? As we build digital products and services, we should seek ways to protect human dignity of the living, dying, and the deceased. So my hope is that over the next years, we'll see a real change in how we approach death and dying, as well as digital legacy, especially as more and more active online users die. I believe that there are a few ingredients that can help us collectively to improve and support grieving in a world that's increasingly digital. And they are: the government regulations need to catch up with the tech evolution. Businesses need to include ethical considerations into their decision-making processes. And users need to improve their habits in managing their digital information, which can be mostly useful to them while they are alive, but also helps them leave their matters relatively well organized if something happens to them. Finally, as designers, we have the unique opportunity to shape the digital products and services to help our users transition between the life and death. I will end with a quote by Clay Shirky. Revolution doesn't happen when society adopts new technologies. It happens when society adopts new behaviors. Thank you. That was it.
Yeah, it was really thought-provoking and a big part of human existence in a way. So thank you for leaving us with a lot of questions, which will eventually come up as a food for thought for most of us today. Now let us move to the second part of the show, where we will converse. We'll talk about how your journey as a designer has been. So let me start with the first very simple question that I ask most of our guests, and that is, when and how did you think of becoming a designer, and how did it start for you?
That's a good question. I think that for me, I always was a kid that liked to play with many different things, and I always sort of leaned towards some sort of visual arts. Mm-hmm. And I was in a Girl Scouts group, and like we did lots of things. And one of the leaders that we had, she was actually doing visual education degree, and so that was a big inspiration in the beginning. But it wasn't a given thing for me, for sure. I also considered to do sign language college. So among all of these things, the different things I was exploring, I managed to get into visual design college. Mm-hmm. And over the time, I realized that I lean towards digital, especially when I then went to Portugal to do an exchange program as part of my college degree. And I had a class that was called Publishing and Editorial Design. And essentially it was a web design course. So I learned how to program a little bit back then in PHP. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of how I then translated or into the user experience field, and sort of stuck with it ever since.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. And you've worked in a lot of places, be it different countries or be it different companies and various different roles. Do you want to talk about like your experience, how it shaped up, taking one bit at a time, and then how did you transform into different sort of domains?
Sure. So as I said, my bachelor's degree is in visual design, and my master's is in multimedia.
Mhm.
Um, and so during my master's, I was in another exchange program. It was an internship in Austin, Texas, and I was working with a BI company. I didn't at the time. I didn't necessarily know what I want to be doing, but that just happened. And so through that, I got a, a recommendation or a referral to Namecheap, and I started focusing on the user experience way more. And through that and throughout my career, I ended up having experience working on the marketing department. Um, and because I knew a little bit of coding, obviously with engineers, and I think that that was super important to me to understand that I can do something that I really enjoy doing. I can get paid for doing what I enjoy doing. And I guess like through interacting with all sorts of different people and all sorts of different professions and having to solve for very different problems, it just really helps me to navigate this space and understand the different points of view and relate with those areas a little bit more. And I just find it super helpful to the fact that I have this diverse experience. And I think one thing worth noting is after I left Namecheap, where I was for about 5 years, and ended up leading this amazing brand experience team, I decided that I didn't have enough experience, or like it has been too long for me to be actually on the ground doing the design work because my role there ended up being way more managerial. And so I decided to take a step back and join a team as a designer, as a contributor, to just kind of relearn how it works. And because obviously the discipline and the UX area has evolved over the time. So I was interested in understanding how the teams work differently and what I can bring into my future career. And so through that, I ended up going, I guess, between different companies. And I was always mindful of like trying to get the breadth of the experience in the different roles or focusing a little bit on different areas. For example, when I joined Oracle, I joined to focus on user research because again, I was interested to like really dig in more into what user research really means and how I can use it.
Yeah, great. So I understand that the Thanatos sensitive the project, the Dead People project, is your passion project, which started as a thesis project, if I'm correct, in the multimedia program that you did as masters, and then you continued working for it for some years. So how do you keep up with it? Like, do you collaborate with people? Is like a time that you have allocated for it? So how do you engage with it?
So actually, it started even earlier. It started as my bachelor's, actually. And it isn't like, it definitely is my passion project. It definitely is something that's not necessarily part of my day-to-day, although sometimes I try to, I try to like talk to people about it and I try to figure out like, is there something we could do as the company or using the company to just kind of change a little bit the way how things are. But because it's a side project, it definitely isn't a full-time thing, right? And so the progress, it's definitely slower than I would like it to be, just because of the nature and the amount of time I have to deal with that. But I think the key is the people, and I end up talking to a lot of very inspiring people and just people who are genuinely interested. And I think the biggest driver to move this forward is whenever I talk to someone about this, very often it's something that nobody really considered. And it always sparks a really good conversation. And a lot of the times there are ideas that come out of these conversations that then I can sort of take and do some more research on it, or, you know, like take it and somehow bring it in to some of the thinking and some of the work that I'm doing around this topic.
So how did the idea of digitality after the life occur to you? Like, and yeah, so how did it start for you? Like,
So it really was, it really was when my dad died, right? Because we had, I think it started not necessarily as digital. It started just like by some frustrations that I had around dealing with the legacy. Like, for example, when we showed up at the notary, who in the Czech Republic is in charge of sort of like guiding the family through the legal process of distributing the legacy, right? I have an older sister, and we have the same father, but we are not, and we actually have even the same last name, but we are not, we don't have the same mother. And so she was officially listed on his funeral documents, and so they knew to contact her. And so when I showed up with her at the office, they almost shut the door in front of my face because they just didn't know that he had two daughters, right? And so I was like, how is this even possible? Like, there are documents there, there must be something like that they can look at to understand like who are actually um, all the people who are supposed to inherit something, right? And so that's how it started. And then building onto that, we were obviously trying to get rid of some of the stuff that he had because we didn't need it or whatever. And so I was going through his stuff, and when I was going through his computer, he had tons of pictures from our family vacations and whatnot. And I found a picture of his girlfriend naked in a hotel room. And I was like, I really wished I could unsee this because that's just like not something you want to carry in your mind as a memory of your father. But so that was sort of like something that brought me onto the digital path of the things, because I was like, well, you know, like, how am I supposed to make sense of his information, and how am I supposed to know what is the important stuff versus like what is the stuff that, you know, I shouldn't even look at. Like, so that was that.
so you've lived in different countries, right? Like Czech and then Portugal, and the cultural backgrounds would have been very different. So, was there any learning from these varied cultural backgrounds that you were in?
Certainly there was many learnings from from the different cultural backgrounds. I think there was many learnings just on personal level, right? Like, I think just the realization that, and especially in Europe, right, or like in the Western countries, because like if you go to Asia or somewhere, like the cultural differences are more apparent, but in the Western world, we like, I guess you sort of assume that people function in similar way, but they just don't, because there is a lot of history that sort of shapes the culture, right, and how people approach their lives and stuff. And so I think, like, for me, living in Portugal, it was a way for me to realize how little I knew even about my own culture, because people would ask you the question like, how is something in the Czech Republic, right, all the time. And I just realized that what I know, even of my own country, is like a very limited amount of stuff. And it just sort of made me appreciate that fact, and also I think because I became much more aware of this, I became also much more interested in those cultural differences, and to really ask the questions and be curious about like, where are people coming from, why they are thinking what they are thinking. And I think it just like makes you much more humble, and you know, and you don't jump into conclusions, or like you don't make certain things that otherwise you would just do. And then on the digital death, or the Dead People project, I think it was also super interesting because the way we experience death and dying, and I guess like what happens after somebody dies is very different even across Europe. In the Czech Republic, like the person dies, and then about a week later you have a funeral, and that's about it. Versus like in Portugal, for example, they have a series of masses that they start even the day that the person dies, and then it goes on in specific time periods for a while. And that again is something where you realize like, we don't really have that time to mentally process what's going on. Versus obviously there is a big debate whether like people, whether the funeral rituals should be driven by religious rituals, right, or not. But it sort of gives you a little bit of time to process what's going on and really be there with the feelings and with the emotions that you have. And I think it's sort of healthy, but maybe I also think it's healthy because I didn't necessarily have that. But yeah, there's lots of things that one can really draw from an experience like that.
Sure. So there are a lot of things that you're obviously doing. There's experience in terms of working in a consulting way, and then the projects, and then keeping yourself inspired and things like that. So was wondering, how does a day in your life looks like?
Oh my, my day in my life is super boring. I think what I try to do, especially these days, is like when I get up, I go out of my house to get a coffee somewhere, and just kind of walk a little bit to get into the mindset that I need to, switch from the being at home to being at work thing, while both are the same place. And then and then my day is usually split between like tons of calls, and then some time that I try to preserve to actually be able to do some work. And then at night, I do literally the same thing. I just like close the computer and then go out for a walk, and come back, and then I read, or I watch some series, or I do a little bit of writing or something like that. But it certainly isn't super exciting these days.
Coming to the remote working aspect of it, like the way the things are right now, have come down to be. So how is it working for you, like when you're working remotely, and trying to make sense of various workshops and people and users? So how has it impacted you?
Yeah, so I think I have a little bit of an advantage because most of my career I really worked remote. When I worked for Namecheap, we were a globally distributed team. We had team members like literally all over the place, like from the US all the way to India. So I think like some of the basic habits of how to not get crazy in a world like this, I already had. I know that, I should get dressed and probably not stay in my PJs because it just like helps my mind function. um, but I think I think today, comparably to the, I guess, 10 years ago, for example, we have much better tools to us the digital aspect of the work. So we have like whiteboarding tools, right? Or we have, I guess, like even the Zoom we are on right now, like has now like some great features like the breakout rooms or whatever, which before we would emulate by running in parallel multiple tools and having multiple sessions running in parallel. Like it was doable. It was just like a little bit like more tedious to do it, right? So I think for me, it hasn't changed much besides the fact that after working this way for many, many years, I decided that I really need people around me. And this current situation has taken that away a little bit from me. And so I feel like tired by the constant digital interactions, right? Because it's not the same thing as if you are talking to a real human. But I think the biggest change was for a lot of people I work with, this wasn't the normal thing to do. Like, I think on the technology side, like we're luckier that we are more comfortable with the digital tools. But for people who are primarily used to talk to people and travel to meet people and interact with people in real life, and who weren't at all at the beginning of this whole thing used to like video conferencing tools and stuff like that. It is still a little bit of an adjustment. They got really good at it, but it's still some things that come natural to me or to my technologist colleagues don't come naturally to people who are not technologists. So we need to help them and they need a little bit of help, but it's working to the best it can.
So you work with a lot of people, right, from different disciplines and streams. Some of them are non-designers. So how do you emphasize the value of design and help them?
I think my view on what design is has changed tremendously over time, right? I think at the very beginning, it was about like, how can I make this website really pretty, right? And like user testing wasn't really a thing back then or whatever. Like it was just like really about trying to show I can produce like a pretty website. But over the time, I think that I realized that design is essentially an enabler for companies that and we can really help them to, I guess, through challenging whether the problem they are trying to solve is really the right problem to solve, or like helping them understand their users or their customers, to make sure that whatever they are building is actually doing something useful for the customer base that they have, right? And so I do strongly believe that design is a team sport. It's not something that like I as a designer can do on my own. I will always need other people or the users or somebody who really understands very deeply the domain we are working in to work with me. But I think there is a really strong case that we can make about how design can contribute to the organizations by really making sure we are building the right things for the right people in the right way.
And when you encounter different people come with different set of mindset in terms of how they solve problem, and in the multidisciplinary teams there's always these things where there's a clash of ideas, and specifically people who are like away from design domain. Let's say let's talk about engineers in that case. So when you're talking about some feature, let's say that you want to implement, and then people are obviously not in the same frame of mind. So how do you get that value of design or your thoughts processed to them?
That's a good question. So I think that there were times I really struggled with engineers But I think that one thing that's super important is that as designers, we should be curious about how the engineers work, right? Or anybody for that matter. Like what are the ways of working on their side? And have a little bit of understanding how they think about things, because that can help us to like kind of frame or phrase things in a way that they can understand in more easier way. I think what also helps is to bring them in the process, right? As the design evolves and is created, because then we are sort of creating the culture of co-creation. And when we show them that like we are doing something because we have evidence that that's the right thing to do, then they are more likely to just kind of contribute and help us to really do, to get to the best outcome possible. And also I think like it's about inviting them to really, like it's about explaining them how we do things as well, right? Because it's a two-way street. But also like inviting them into contributing their ideas also helps.
Yeah, no, that's great pointers. Some of them even some of them even I employ in terms of doing it. Coming to approaches in terms of time deadline. So always, I think there has always been a case where you have timeline and a project that you need to do, and sometimes there are very short timelines that you have to run in terms of sprints or maybe project. How do you manage that? What is your approach in sort of solving these questions?
So I think I'm going to contradict myself a little bit. That happens a lot. And I think humans are the worst people in estimation. And there are other humans who are like super terrible at like giving people the time they need to actually do their job properly, right? So I think it's twofold. Like one thing is I try to make sure that I have enough time as much as I can by really pushing back on whoever is asking me to do something crazy on a crazy timeline. And that has varying level of success, right? Like sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And I think there are two ways like that, like, or two things that I do when it doesn't work. And one of them is like I end up working really long hours, and which is not sustainable. But then on the other hand, I know that there are going to be periods where the workload is going to be a little lighter. So I try to, I guess, balance that out this way. And then the other thing is you just sort of cut off the discovery, or like you don't experiment that much. You just like kind of use your expertise and your best judgment to do whatever feels the most reasonable. And which is obviously not the best way to do it, but sometimes it's just what it is.
Yeah, so true. And in the times like these, right, what is keeping you motivated? Like, how do you motivate yourself?
I think that a lot of the times it's just I'm fortunate enough to work on projects that I really enjoy, with most of the time with people I really enjoy working with. So for me, it is about making sure that the team gets to where they need to be by the time they need to be there. And so for me, I think the biggest driver is the collaboration with the team and making sure that the team really has what it needs.
Okay. And as a designer, what inspires you?
I think it's many things, and I think we talked about some of them already, right? So it's a lot of it is just having open eyes and looking around and trying to understand why people are doing what they are doing, and even why people I disagree with are doing what they are doing, because I think that's super helpful to gain some perspective. And then I have lots of, I guess, references of people who are doing things that I really think is great stuff, or has some sort of value. And so, funnily enough, like most of these people are not necessarily like super well known, or, you know, like it might be just friends, or it might be some other designers that I studied with, or people from even from different areas, that just, I think like they are good at what they are doing, and it just having conversations with them, and just kind of understanding where they are at, just really sparks a lot of ideas on my own.
Great. Do you have some advice for young and budding designers?
Ah. So I think there's probably a few things. One of them is, and we also talked a little bit about it today already, is I would totally encourage looking for as many diverse experiences as possible, because I think it helps you understand like what you prefer, what's your preferred way, or like what are your preferred projects, or what is your preferred way of working. And I think you can really only gain that by actually trying it out, because you can listen to like your other peers and talk about their experiences, but I think you will never know whether it's the right thing for you unless you really try it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it is okay to have dreams, and I think it is okay to dream big. um, and just sort of like, I personally am not much of a planner. So like my approach to this is like, I have like some dreams and aspirations, and I just like look for the opportunities that sort of help me get there, which I think is a valid way to do it. But there, I know a lot of people who have that North Star, and they really like reverse engineer the plan how to get there. So I think like figure out like what's the way you want to go about it. But definitely don't be shy and go for it.
Uh, I just wanted, just a second. Yeah, my screen is full at this point of time. That's the digital for us. But yeah, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today, Katrina. This is a small token of appreciation from us for all the good work that you keep doing, and inspiring us and the next generation of designers that are coming along. Um, we wish to confer upon you the title of inspiring young designer. And thank you so much for sharing and answering our questions today.
Thank you for having me.